It's time to set those lineups for week 4, and you need to know where your favorite players stack up. So today I'm bringing you my week 4 IDP rankings to get you ready for fantasy football this week, and we're going to get to that right now. Welcome back to the Dynasty Rewind YouTube channel. My name is Bob Van, the IDP man, and as you can see, we have a bit of a different format than we normally do for these IDP rankings. If you know me at all, you know I'm always in the lab cooking up new ways to bring you guys the content, and I hope this format suits your liking. Instead of just having the one locked graphic of the rankings coming into the video, now if I see players that I'm a little more hesitant on, I can move them down my rankings, as well as if I see a player that I end up being higher on, I can move them up my rankings as well. Please feel free to let me know down in the comments below if you do enjoy this format. I kind of hope we do end up in one of those situations where I do end up moving a player up or down, so that way we can kind of get into my thought process and why I'm moving that player up or down. And as always, if you're enjoying the video, I do hope you leave a like, maybe subscribe if you're new. We are bringing you daily fantasy football content here at the Dynasty Rewind, focusing on all assets of Dynasty fantasy football all year round, whether it's IDP, whether it's rookies, whether it's offense, you name it. And now, while I've been droning on and on, you've obviously been able to take a quick look at my top 18 IDP rankings, starting off with Roquan Smith at number 1, just kind of showing up to be a bona fide stud this year, has had a couple big games, has that great tackle floor, and brings you quite a bit of upside any given game. Moving on to Bobby Wagner, a guy who I had ranked a little lower coming into the season. I was a little concerned that, we'd start to see some wear and tear on those tires, but he's done nothing but prove me wrong. Had 20 tackles in one game last week, had a good tackle game this week again. Just a guy who shows no signs of stopping, just as heady of a player as he was last year, and really seems to be aging like a fine wine in Seattle. Moving on to number 3, Devin White, another bona fide stud. All these guys, you're probably not picking between these guys on who you're starting unless you're in a really shallow IDP league, in which case you need to have a serious talk with your commissioner. But Devin White, another solid stud. I have no gripes with him, brings you a lot of upside as well. And then to kind of fast forward to number 9 on this list, Lavonte David, a guy who I really flop back and forth on. I think he has a good matchup this week, but I'm really curious to see how Devin White does when Lavonte David is eventually out of the picture. Lavonte David is not getting any younger. He's a great player, but he is definitely on his way out. Everybody has to hang it up sometime. I don't think it's going to be this year, maybe not even next year, but I'm very curious what Devin White looks like in that defense without Lavonte David by his side. Moving on to number 4, and this is probably another guy who's been kind of disappointing so far this year, Darius Leonard. And I think a lot of this boils down to him dealing with that ankle injury, but we really shouldn't be that surprised. Anytime he's dealing with an injury, usually he is not the same guy. But when he gets going and he's healthy, he's still one of the best linebackers in the league. Moving on to number 5, Patrick Queen, another guy who I was kind of lower on coming into the season. And a lot of that was simply just because he just did not have a safe tackle floor to go along with his big play upside. But it seems this year he looks a heck of a lot more stocky, more built, ready to rock and roll, take the punches as a linebacker on that defense and get involved in the tackle game. And he's definitely done that so far this year. Hasn't really disappointed thus far. And against a stumbling run game at Denver this weekend, I think he has a pretty good shot to replicate that performance. Moving on to number 6, and that's Eric Kendricks, the guy who has really showed up this year. Seems just to be a man on a mission, and I don't know what it is, but he just seems to be a heck of a lot better than he has been in years past. He's definitely had a couple years where he's been an absolute dude, but he has had a few years where he's fallen off. This seems to be one of the years where he's in great shape and definitely a solid fantasy asset. So we already have our first moves on the board. I moved Zach Cunningham up as well as Isaiah Simmons over Joe Schobert and Lavonte David and Harrison Smith. And it really just seems like Zach Cunningham is back in the mix. I don't know what his deal was, if he just wasn't seeing eye to eye with that defensive coordinator or what the case was, but it seems he's back in the well graces of that defense. Had a great week for you on Thursday. Started your week off with a bang. Moving on to number 8, and that's Isaiah Simmons, as I mentioned. And this is, Isaiah Simmons honestly is kind of turning into what I expected Zaven Collins to be this year. I wasn't expecting Arizona to sit Zaven Collins especially after they said hey, he's going to be our starting Mike linebacker the day after the draft, which is the most frustrating of frustrating coach speak. And I don't know if it's related to his reckless driving incident or if it is just a matter of hey, we want to use Jordan Hicks, who we're paying a lot of money to, or if it's just the factor of this dude's just not ready to be our top linebacker in this defense, which, not to toot my own horn, I wouldn't be all that surprised about because I was not that high on him as a prospect. It's just one of the cases it could be. I'm leaning towards personally it being the least likely case, that it's just It's either that they want to use Jordan Hicks up while he's still there, or it is somewhat of a punishment for the offseason shenanigans. But either which way, Isaiah Simmons rocking out this year. Big playmaker, great player on that defense so far. See, this is almost too dangerous. I moved Levante David back over Joe Schobert. Now discussing Joe Schobert at number 10 going against my Green Bay Packers. And I don't think we've really seen the full impact of Joe Schobert yet. I will definitely say that he's left a lot to be desired. Devin Bush has been the linebacker to roster as long as he's been healthy. However, we've only had a 1-game sample size really of him being a fully healthy linebacker. I'm not ready to put up the red flag with Joe Schobert quite yet. I still think he's a great linebacker overall. I think he's still just kind of getting his feet wet in that Pittsburgh defense. And we do have to remember he didn't come over till the start of August. So he's really only about a month into that playbook. Moving on to our first safety on this list, and that's Harrison Smith, a guy who I've been pretty religiously lower on coming into this season. You know, in a lot of league settings, for me, he just hasn't been all that high of a scorer or that worthwhile of a player for several years, but he seems to be a heck of a lot better this year. Similar to Eric Kendricks, I don't know what the deal is. I don't know if they got a kick in the pants that said, hey, go be better, or what the case is, but Harrison Smith has been an absolute baller this year and deserves the number 1 spot from time to time. We have Jamal Adams at number 12, and we just haven't really seen that big game yet this year, but he's a guy with so much talent that I can't help but think that it's sooner rather than later. We're not even really into the season yet. We're coming into week 4. It's a long year. The studs are going to turn into studs. So Jamal Adams, I'm not worried about him one bit yet. Moving on to number 13, Deion Jones on that Atlanta defense that is absolute garbage. Leading the way yet again in terms of production. Just a solid linebacker that you can rely on pretty much week in and week out. Another guy we're going to be moving down real quick is Fred Warner, and we're going to move him just below this list. And again, it's just kind of the same concerns. You know, he was off to a decent start this season, and it just hasn't really kind of continued. It is only week 4. Like I mentioned, you know, this is a small sample size. If you have him on your team, I'm not too worried. Just don't think he deserves top 10 consideration this week. He's still a great player. He's one of those guys who really shines on the field. Doesn't really get a whole lot done in the stat column, which unfortunately is the most important part for your fantasy team. Taking him out of there puts Jordan Poyer up at 14, and he's another guy that, you know, just gets older and he's still doing just fine. You can throw him in your lineup with some confidence. Moving on to number 15, that's Logan Wilson, who has been an absolute stud this season, racking up over 30 tackles in 3 weeks as well as 3 interceptions. This is a guy I definitely underestimated coming into the season. I wasn't high on anybody in that linebacker room. Just kind of wrote everybody off, thought it was a safety show with Von Bell and Jesse Bates. And Jesse Bates is out this week, but I do think that Logan Wilson is definitely hurting Jesse Bates' production, which sucks for him, one of my favorite players in the league. But as one star falls, another seems to rise in the IDP realm. Logan Wilson is that guy. I mentioned him in the waiver wire video this week. Do go back and check that out if you have not yet, but still widely unrostered on Sleeper. And with Sleeper being a majorly Dynasty focused platform, if you can get your hands on this guy, you probably have an LB1 for at least a few years. Moving on to 16, that's Budda Baker, another guy we're just kind of waiting on that big game from. Brings a lot of upside on a weekly basis as well as a pretty safe tackle floor more often than not. However, he's kind of in that same boat of Isaiah Simmons, kind of taking away some of his work in my opinion, which just isn't leaving a whole lot on the bones for Budda Baker. Moving on to Derwin James at 17, and probably one of the guys at DB who has the most potential out of anybody any given week. But the injury scares and the injuries themselves are just kind of really eating away at this guy. You know, left this last game, I believe, with that shoulder issue kind of flaring up in the game. Was able to return pretty shortly, but it's just one of those things like, it's like, is this dude ever going to be healthy? And I know it's early. Last year was a freak injury. ACLs are the least predictive injuries, if you ask me, unless you've already had an ACL injury. But the year before that, dealing with a foot injury, which could have led to the ACL injury, don't get me wrong. But now dealing with a shoulder issue, just a totally different issue. I don't want to write this guy off as injury prone yet, but it is just kind of that when you have such a small window of time and you've dealt with so many injuries, it's hard not to be concerned. Moving on to number 18, that's Jerome Baker, linebacker on the Miami Dolphins. You know, Landon Roberts had a pretty good week this week. However, Jerome Baker is going to be the guy you want to roster more often than not. Okay, so really quick, I did want to take a break from today's ranking to bring you my Thursday night football predictions and to shout out our great sponsor, Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is one of the most fun ways to play over and unders throughout the season. Get your pick'ems in with your rival props. So as you can see the prediction board behind me, I have Cincinnati winning 27-17. I think it's going to be a pretty handily win by Cincinnati. Trevor Lawrence in Jacksonville just just doesn't seem to have it together quite yet. So I'm bringing you my 4 favorite picks for this matchup that'll make this game that much more fun to watch. The first pick I'm going to make is the 14.5 rushing yard over for Trevor Lawrence. He's had over 20 rushing yards in his last 2 games, and I don't really expect this to be any different. He's going to be running all over the place, just trying to get free and make a play where he can. Looking at the over-unders, I'm going to be looking at CJ Uzomah under. No tight end has really done much damage against Jacksonville thus far this season outside of Pharaoh Brown in week 1 on Houston. And CJ Uzomah only has 2 receptions on the year for 4 total yards. So then another thing we can do then is check out the rival tab, which is one of my favorite ways to play. With over-unders, they're cool and all, but I really like these because instead of over-under picks where, say, you pick the under and the over hits really early in the game, you're done with your pick set. Like, you can't root anything on. Whereas with the rival picks, they go all game long. Unless you get blown out of the water really quick, there's still a chance for your players to bounce back and win that prop for you. So my favorite one here is the James Robinson receiving yardage prop, having 20.5 yards. I believe on the season, James Robinson has more receiving yards than Laviska Shenault. If not, it's pretty darn close. So 46 yards receiving last week, 17 the week prior, and then 48 yards receiving for Viska last week and -3 the week prior. So James Robinson does in fact have more receiving yards on the season than Laviska Shenault, and he gets that 20.5 receiving yard buffer. And the last pick I'm going to make is the Jamar Chase versus Marvin Jones pick. Jacksonville has been horrendous at defending number 1 wide receivers on the opposing team. With T. Higgins being out, it is really just the Jamar Chase show. And I love me some Marvin Jones, but I just don't think it's going to be all that close despite having that 0.5 buffer on Jamar Chase. Just makes it that much better. I'm going to put in my $5 bid, hit submit, confirm, and I'm good to go. I have my slip set for Thursday night, and I have that much more to cheer for. If you want to ride with me over on Underdog Fantasy, you can use the link in the description box below, or use promo code REWIND at checkout when you make your first deposit. You'll get a free $10 to play with, which you can use to copy my prop, throw it into a mix. Heck, you could get a $100 payout tonight. Or you could use that $10 to put in for the Best Ball Resurrection going on at Underdog Fantasy. That's right, you heard, more best ball drafts, more season-long best ball drafts starting right now, going from week 6 all the way through the rest of the season. If your best ball teams are trash now because of all the injuries that have happened and all the unforeseen circumstances that we've had so far this year, you have your second chance to get in on the Best Ball Resurrection. Drafts are open right now, and they close in 2 weeks. Use that free $10 you get when you make that first deposit any which way you want, but don't be afraid to get in on that Best Ball Resurrection draft. I will be dropping at least one draft video covering the Best Ball Resurrection. I hope y'all stay tuned for that. And that is it for the Thursday Night Football prediction segment. I do hope y'all get over to Underdog Fantasy. I hope to see you there. Now let's cut back to the rankings. Moving on to number 19, Logan Ryan, one of the best DBs still in the league, has a great role on that New York Giants defense. All right, so I did bump down Shaq Thompson fairly significantly, bumping him down 8 spots from 20. And I'll admit that I think Shaq Thompson does look pretty dang good this year, but already kind of falling off from his really hot start in week 1. So I'm tempering my expectations throughout the rest of the season. So to get back on track, and at number 20, Hassan Reddick, who has just been an absolute dude this year, has 1.5 sacks in every game so far. You've been able to put him in every single week at DL, and he has not disappointed you one bit. Moving on to number 21, that's Miles Jack, another guy who has, I wouldn't say blown up or done anything too crazy this year. He's been a very solid, steady option for you as the head of that defense, but still not taking those leaps and bounds we would have liked to have seen for him coming into the season. Just kind of seems like a middle tier linebacker at best. You know, finding him in the 20s, that's kind of what you expect out of the guy. Moving on to number 22, Nick Bosa, arguably the best defensive end in the league, going against Seattle this week, a divisional matchup. And Seattle being one of the worst offensive lines, I'd expect them to give up a hearty amount of sacks to that San Fran defensive line. Moving on to another defensive end, we got some defensive ends and safeties coming in hot on this list now. That's Danielle Hunter at 23, absolutely looking like his former self so far this season, wreaking havoc on opposing offensive lines. Any issues or concerns that were there with his injury last year are completely faded away. Do not worry. Feel free to slot him in your lineup if you have him. And now moving on to one of the more interesting topics I'd say this week, and that is Tay Crowder, New York Giants linebacker, now filling in for Blake Martinez, who is going to be missing the rest of the season with an ACL tear. I mentioned this in the IDP waiver wire video, and Tay Crowder is not going to be a 1-for-1 replacement. He's going to be about a tier and a half down from what Blake Martinez likely was, but I still think he's going to be a guy you can throw in your lineup as an LB2. high-end LB3 more often than not. Moving on to number 25, that's Eric Wilson, the linebacker to roster on Philly. I was a big Alex Singleton fan coming into the season, but it's been proven time and time again that Eric Wilson is going to get the reps. He's going to be more involved in the big playmaking opportunities. That's just the kind of player that Eric Wilson is, and Alex Singleton just doesn't have that in his toolkit. But moving on to Von Bell, who gets a bit of a bump this week up to 26. I think the safety 5 this week, but with no Jesse Bates this week, it's going to be up to Von Bell. So he's not necessarily playing Bates' spot at all, or he's going to be contributing to that spot, but just one less person on that defense that's reliable enough to make tackles as needed. Going again to Shaq Thompson at 28, already discussed him at length. Moving on to 29, Devondre Campbell, who I'm just not sold on yet. I'm a Packers fan, and I just don't buy into the fact that Devondre Campbell is really going to be all that good. 2 splash plays back-to-back weeks. I don't see that continuing. He's not a high-profile playmaker. He's more of that tackle floor type of guy. So I think he's at a pretty good spot. I think he's good as an LB2, LB3. Anywhere higher, I think you're kind of wishing on a lot more than you should be. But moving on to Tracy Walker at number 30. Starting off pretty solid this season. Had a down week last week. But, finally out of that Patricia scheme. Has a DB coach as his coordinator. I think the sky's the limit for him to continue to improve and get even better. In 1 second, I have a few more changes to make. So I went ahead and bumped Myles Garrett up to 31. And, Myles Garrett, had an absolute gangbusters week against Chicago last week, going against Minnesota this week. Another bad offensive line. And I definitely don't think he's going to have the same performance. Myles Garrett, the thing with him is he's rarely linked really good performances back to back. He's DN4, so it's not like he's sitting behind a lot of players. A lot of these guys you're not necessarily dealing between, you're dealing with more position groups as opposed to this type of ranking. Speaking of that, let me know down in the comments below if you'd rather see just a positional ranking for each group as opposed to this long list of mixed players. That's something where maybe I could drop a shorter video covering each position specifically. Just let me know down in the comments. I'd really appreciate it. But moving on from Myles Garrett and onto Denzel Perriman at 32, a guy who I've just had such a tough time buying into because of past performances, again, usually indicate what you're going to be in this league. Rarely do players just all of a sudden 1 year, they're just 5 years in the league. It's like, oh, time to turn on the switch and be great at being a linebacker again. Or for the first time ever. Denzel Perriman was a guy who a lot of people had pretty high hopes for and was somebody who was supposed to be like the linebacker 1 on the Chargers for so long. Now he comes over to Las Vegas and he comes out gangbusters. He has over 10 tackles each week. And like I mentioned in my waiver wire video, he's a guy who everybody wanted Corey Littleton to be when he went to that team. Moving on to another player who's just not performed yet this season, Jeremy Chin at 33. And, he's just going to keep probably plummeting down this list until he pulls off a really good week. Moving on to 34, Justin Simmons, safety on the Denver Broncos. And honestly, right now, I'm just going to go ahead and move him over Jeremy Chin because he should be over Jeremy Chin. So making moves, Justin Simmons moving over Jeremy Chin to be number 33 as opposed to 34. Nick Vigil gets bumped up to 35, taking over the Eric Wilson role from last season in Minnesota. And then Jalen Smith actually rounding up the top 36. As long as Micah Parsons is playing down at defensive end or most of his snaps there, I don't think Jalen Smith is going to be the same guy that he was over the last couple years, but I do think he's going to be a heck of a lot better as long as this shift is in place. That is it for my week 4 IDP rankings. I do hope you enjoyed the video and you aren't scared away by this huge headshot here. Just happened to be the best headshot I could get for this part of the video. But please do me a favor, comment down below if you enjoyed this format and enjoyed kind of seeing the inner workings as I move around rankings. Definitely get over to Underdog Fantasy, use the link in the description box below or use promo code REWIND at checkout when you make your first deposit. Get in on that Best Ball Resurrection draft. I will definitely see you there in those. I do hope y'all enjoyed the video. Please leave a like if you did. Check out the other videos on the channel. I'd really appreciate it. If you're already subscribed, you're well appreciated. We just hit 600 subscribers and that is awesome. I can't wait to meet and interact with more of you as time goes on. But that is it for me today, y'all. I do hope y'all have a good one.